Welcome to Noon Hour Slides from the Moose Jaw Museum and Art Gallery. We're located on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional lands of the Blackfoot, Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We pay our respects to First Nations and Métis ancestors and reaffirm our relationship with one another. We gratefully acknowledge funding from the City of Moose Jaw, SaskArts, SaskCulture, Saskatchewan Lotteries, Canada Council for the Arts, Canadian Heritage, and the Government of Canada. I'm Vincent Hotelling, the administrative assistant here. I'm here to welcome you to today's presentation, the last in this series. I'd like to thank everybody for taking part in this series and making it particularly successful this year. We hope to see you all again in the fall. Don Dickinson is here to give his presentation, Time Travel in Moose Jaw, looking at Main Street then and now. Welcome.
This is 1884 Moose Jaw, and you're looking at this and you're saying, oh, what's going on here? But what we have right down here is where the cornerstone would be. This is Foley's Hotel right here. Across the street, this little building here is a little building on the right side, which is where Pellis Fruit would be. Everybody remember Pellis Fruit, that little skinny building? River Street would be right about here. That's where that is. There's Foley's, 1884. This might be a little later, but anyway, it's before 1891. Back again, here you are, Foley's. This would be where the cornerstone is, right here on the left on the corner. Oh, there we go. We got it now. We're all here. So anyway, this would be where the cornerstone is right now. This is for some of us who are around my age, this would be about where Assiniboia Music was. And this would be about where Joiners was later on, Woolworths, etc. on down the line. So when we go back here to 1884, we can see that this little place here would be Pellis Fruit. Right around here would be where the Masonic Temple is. And down here, this is the Union Bank, Wellington White Building. That's not what it is now, but that's what it is today. That's where John's Music is and all of that. So that's what you're looking at here. So this whole talk is going to be about how we get from here, lovely photo by Chad Klein, done with a, from the, yes, one of those things. And we're going from here to here. First of all, everybody's going to humor me, hopefully. I'm going to talk about how I got into this. Not going to take too much time with it. We're already into this for 5 minutes while I figured out the technology. I got into this at a very, very early age. I was interested in photography. Sadly, not so much that I actually bought a camera when I was a kid and took photos of Moose Jaw from the 50s and 60s. But I used to be the family archivist. From the time I was 5 years old, I would put all the photographs away into a drawer. I'd take the family photographs, I'd load the film, do everything. Love pictures. That's where I got into it. It wasn't necessarily the history. Not someone like Leith Knight or Bruce Fairman, who are just meticulous in their detail of Moose Jaw's history, but I was going from the photography end of things. My family does have a long history for Moose Jaw. My great-grandfather is David Hawks, his wife Betsy. He is the second person to be buried in the Moose Jaw Cemetery. He was killed on May 21st, 1889. As you can see, he was out milking a cow. Betsy was standing beside him. I don't know the cow's name, but lightning came in, struck him dead, struck the cow dead, and struck Betsy deaf. But they had a daughter, Mary Matilda. She went by the name of Matilda. And she met up with John Hector Smith, who was homesteading on a quarter section of land just north of Moose Jaw, just east of the number 2 highway. And Hawk's family was living in the Caron area at the time. Oh, somebody's drawing. And so Mary and John got together. You can see them here. Matilda, John Hector. And this is not my grandfather. This is my great-grandparents here. This is actually a cousin of mine. So this is a later photograph, 1947. But these two gave birth to 4 sons and 1 daughter. And one of those sons was this gentleman right here, John Hector Smith Jr. This gal here is my grandmother, and Nettie Janet came from Uddingston in Scotland. And these two met when this young fellow who joined at the age of 16 was sent over when he was 17, and he was wounded in France digging trenches, and he convalesced in and out of England. They'd send him back to the front, they'd send him back to England because things weren't working out for him. And I'm not sure if it was at that time or later, because it has to be remembered that all of these fellows after the war, November 11th, 1918, most of them were in England until September of 1919. So almost a year there. So I think that they met during that time at a dance. So anyway, Janet told her parents in 1921 that she was going to go over and see this young fellow. She wasn't going to go away for long. She was just going to be a year, and she'd be back home. But she got over there, and then this happened. Yes, she never did get back to see her parents, but this happened. Now, this is my mother's right here. She was camera shy that day. That's Edna, but there's actually another child that was born in 41. This house here is where they're standing in front of. You can see it here. It's in the 800 block of Ywca on the west side. They lived in other houses. That's it, but we'll go back to that in a minute. Now, that house on Ywca was actually a friend of theirs. They actually lived over on 5th, smaller house. They did move to this house here, which is, it looks like it's a farm. In actual fact, it's in the city limits, and it is where the tank farm is today. And if you're looking at this over here, just on the left, out of range, is St. Anthony's home, which is Chateau St. Michael's now. This, as you can see, this is the 30s. That is where BA Oil would be. The tracks run right along here. So you're looking northwest. Oh, yay. So that's what you're looking at right there. You're looking northwest. This is Cotto right here. And that's what used to be there. There used to be what looked like a farmhouse. This is Buster. Buster was the family dog. He's guarding what used to be a graveyard up here. Before they actually moved the tank farm, and just as they were moving it, they made sure that no one was left interred up there and moved everybody. So when you live on a place like this in Moose Jaw, this is what happens. You have kids out there. Oh, there's my mom on the far left. You have kids out playing with the cows and all of that. Now, they did move when my grandfather went into the Army a second time in World War II. He went in as a training sergeant. They moved just slightly east of there and a little bit south. You can see Chateau St. Michael's is right here. This is where their farm was. They were moved out of there and they went into this house right here. This house still stands. It's right here. You can see it. This is what it looked like when they lived there. You can tell. I do have a lot of photographs. I got my grandmother's photographs on both sides. I've got tons of family photographs. We won't go through all those, of course. That would just kill it right here. But you can see that that this house is still standing. This house is not. This whole area up here was to be developed. It was supposed to be an upper end area. This little house that my grandmother bought with her family allowance checks when my grandfather was in the Army, it was out of place up there. I think it must have been built just a little earlier than these, because all of the houses up there were going to be two-story extravaganzas, as you can see. And the recession 1913 and then the war, that just did away with that entire subdivision that was supposed to happen up there. But like I say, this house and a couple of others, or one others down the road, is still there. So everybody see where that is? It's 9th Avenue Southeast. So anyway, that's the story of my grandparents on my mother's side. The farm boy, brought up north of Moose Jaw, joined the Army, met this gal here, had 9 children, but he was a farmer all of his life. You can see him here in the 50s. I'm not sure of the pig's name, but this is where they lived near Griffin. And they did keep the quarter section that my great-grandfather homesteaded on north of Moose Jaw up until the 60s. He still farmed there when he lived in Rollo. Now, on the other side of my family, my father's, we've got this. This is my grandfather here. This is my grandmother here. They were different. They were not a farming family, neither one of them. This merchant, I believe, on my grandfather's side, I'm not sure. He might have had some farming background, but he wasn't a farmer. My grandmother, on the other hand, brought up in, oh, this is Ontario. They were brought up in north of Stratford, up in the Lakes country. My grandmother was brought up in Stratford. This is her father, her mother, and you can see she's got a great number of sisters. Her favorite being this one right here, which is Louise. We knew her as Aunt Wee. So you can see that they're quite different than how this fellow was brought up. This fellow worked at Robin Hood Mills. You can see his hat on there. We have this here. So anyway, this young fellow grew up, went to University of Toronto and got his education degree. My grandmother got her teaching certificate. I don't think she got her Bachelor of Education, but got a teaching certificate. They, of course, did not know each other in Ontario. My grandfather came to Moose Jaw to work as a teacher at Victoria School in modern languages. My grandmother, shortly after this photo was taken, came to Moose Jaw to teach at Alexandra, and then she taught at King George for a short time before the two of them got married in 1920. Now, when my grandfather first came here, he lived in this house. At least I believe it's this house. And that is on Stadacona. Anybody who knows Moose Jaw, right next door is the Grayson Mansion. It was not in existence at this time. when he first came here. This is actually Mayor Hopkins' house on Stadacona West, and he lived there. This is what it looks like today. You can see that that house is gone. This house still exists. It's down here, as far as I know. These photos that I'm using come from Street View, so I'm not in Moose Jaw. I'm actually from Victoria, so I can't get there to photograph them. So that's what that looks like to get today on Stadacona West. So he stayed there. My grandmother, she came out with her sister Louise that I talked about earlier. They were inseparable. Here they are in their Stratford home. This is my grandmother here. This is Louise. This is after they came to Saskatchewan. Over here, they're at Katepwa Beach. You can see them. They love going to Katepwa Beach. Then in Moose Jaw, you can see, unlike my grandfather's, on my mother's side, his life and my grandmother, on my mother's side, who is from Uddingston, Scotland, and was a maid and a cook for a wealthy family. These people actually came from a bit of wealth. They came from, you know, scholars, things like that. So here she is playing tennis. This is the Moose Jaw tennis court. She's down here in Crescent Park. Over here is Parkview Apartments. You might know it by looking at it today, just on the east side of the park. That's Parkview Apartments. Actually, you can see it here. This is, this right here being built is the Seabourn Apartments. This is 1911, I believe. This is Crescent Park right here. And there's the Parkview Apartments that we just looked at. That, well, this is what they look like today. And there they are right there, that you can see in my grandmother's photo. You can see them right here. So going back to this, Crescent Park, this is the southeast corner. The subway going under the tracks, not the subway that we know as the subway, but the going under the CN tracks over here towards the hospital would be over in here on this side. But that's Parkview. This is Seabourn. Now the Seabourn was taken down. We know that the Nat was over here, just a little bit to the left here. And we can see that this is what we're looking at. That's, what is that, East Terrace or whatever they call it anyway. Those are the new condos there on Fairford Street. And this is the same sort of view that you're looking at here. So there we have it. There's my grandmother standing there playing tennis. This is her sister Gracie, Grace, that's my grandfather's, Louise, Aunt Wee. This photo here is taken on Central Collegiate's grounds. We're actually facing northeast here. This house is gone. This used to be a store on First Avenue Northwest. These houses are still here, but this is her Alexandra class. This would be about 1918 or 19. Both of these gals stayed at the Y when they first came to Moose Jaw. And so anyway, that's their background, these two families. I showed you my grandfather Smith on my mother's side, grandmother and grandfather Smith, and how they lived. And so we'll just go back here. So these two ended up getting married, and they bought a house on Connaught. And here's the house on Connaught. This is at 888 Connaught. that house still exists. This is them standing out in front of that house. And you can see these houses actually all exist. This is from Street View 2015. So all of these houses still exist. But you can see it was really new at the time. There's not a tree in sight. There's no grass on the boulevards, wood sidewalks. This area is not that old at that time. So anyway, those two got together and they created my father. This is my aunt here. This is Katapwa Beach. And so eventually my mother that you saw earlier, my father, they got together and this happened. And so what you've got there is my grandparents on my father's side, my grandmother from Stratford, my grandfather from Ontario, that met in Moose Jaw. He was a teacher, then a lawyer. She was a teacher, stopped being a teacher when she married my grandfather in 1920. These people here came from Scotland, my grandmother, and he came from north of Moose Jaw, born in Moose Jaw in 1898, and created this happy little couple here. My father's about 20 there. I think my mother is 17 there. She turned 18 years of age about a week later. And so these two got together in 1948, and we ended up on Oak Street eventually, and they created this guy here and this guy here. That's me in the front. You can see Ross Schools over here. And I'm not going to get too much into that. This person here is actually the person she's much to her chagrin right now, I'm sure, that I'm mentioning this. This is Kathleen here. This is the person I live with, Kathleen Hume, me, all of our friends. This is what, and here we are again. There's my buddy John. A few people might know him, John Gibson. There's Kathleen again. John's got his hands on her. Ross School in the background, and me just being who I am. So anyway, we'll just drop all that now. We'll quickly get into, sorry, I took up way more time on that than I wanted to, and I just knew I would. So we're going to get from here to here now. That's where we're going to go. Promise. So these photos are all taken, photos like this, these first ones that we're going to see are all taken from where the train station is. And you say, well, there were 3 train stations. There was the original one, and that one lasted, sorry, Bruce, I can't remember when that was built, 1884, lasted till 1899. This is the dining room. This never burned down. This burned down. They tore this down to create this beautiful structure here. And that was built in 1899. Now, if you think we tear things down quickly now, you can see we tore this one down, didn't even take that long, got to this beautiful structure. And in 1922, it came down and they built this actually in front of it. Well, it was, you can see it's actually quite far back. And while it was still operating, they built this and opened it in 1922. We all know where that is. So looking at, from that point of view, here we go. This 1900, I should mention that. These structures here, you're wondering, well, what happened to them? In 1891, this fire caught in here. One of the, someone knocked over a coal oil lamp or something. I'm sorry, Bruce, I don't want to get into too much detail. Anyway, it wiped out all the buildings here. on this side. And it was stopped by a stone wall building just short of River Street on the west side, but it skipped across here and took out all of these buildings, and it took out more buildings behind it in River Street. So it just literally wiped out most of Main Street. So then I don't have anything in between those two, but we skipped to 1900 from 1891 to 1900 here. One of the buildings that, well, actually these two here, wood frame buildings, they did not get touched by the fire. Who knows? They must have put in a fire break or something like that, because these two here on the corner of Manitoba, you can see this is what's now the cornerstone. They remained. But you can still see in 1900 the vacant spots here. Now all of these buildings are stone or brick buildings for the most part. They were all built in between 1891 and 1900. So then we'll just skip forward into around 1906, 1907. You can see that more structures are starting to be built. We're going to get into all this in a second here. I'm just going to go fairly quickly. So this is 1906. We get into 1908. You can see the building where the Exchange Cafe was built. The Royal ended up being here. The Ywca Block has been built by this time. You can see in the background Zion Church is there. The first post office is here. So it's really beginning to expand quite quickly. We get into just past 1911. You can see the Bank of Hamilton's here. There's various buildings that are being built. This must be 1911, 1912, because it looks to me like the T.W. Robinson, we'll get into that, building is being built. And into the 20s, this would be into the later 20s. It's after the fire. We'll get into that too, at the Masonic Temple. Yeah. But anyway, so you can see that, and oh, we got the Walter Scott building is built there. The new post office is built. T.W. Robinson's building is built. So it's growing really quite rapidly. Now we get into the 30s. The Army and Navy has gone into the T.W. Robinson building. This is basically the moose jaw that everybody knew even in the 50s and 60s. This is basically what we knew. It just, there was growth after 1912, 1913, but it was at a much slower pace. The buildings didn't go up quite as rapidly. Again, 40s. Still, we know that because it's Army Navy still there. They left there in 1944. We get into the 50s. We can see the Met has taken over here, but you know, nothing much is really changing. The occupants of the stores change, of the buildings, but not too much changes. So that is the 50s. And then we get into the 60s, we start to see a little bit of regression, some buildings being lost and things like that. Now, this is the part that I want to get into. And we're doing well here for time. Sorry if I went by that sort of quickly. It's because we're going to touch on a few things here. There was a period, a decade, and it's something that Bruce Fairman and I talked quite a bit about. Prior to me finding out that he was actually writing a book about it, I didn't know it. I always thought about when my grandfather stepped off the train in 1905 to come and teach here. I always wondered, you know, what did he see? And it made me get interested in looking at photographs and thinking about that. And then I started to realize as I was reading that from 1904 to 1914, and I've used that decade just as milestone because 1914 is when things started to drop off again as far as building goes. The vast amount of growth that happened during those boom years, it was phenomenal. I mean, when we take a look at it, 1906 through 1909, $500,000 plus or minus in building permits. That's the equivalent of, let's see, that would be the equivalent of about $12 million today. So that's $12 million, 12 to 15 million per year from 1906 to 1909. 1910, that doubles. We have $1 million, just a little more than $1 million in permits. 1911, we jumped 2.5 times again to $2.5 million. That's in their dollars, not our dollars. And in 1912, it jumps up to $5.3 million, 1913, 4.2 million, and then it starts to drop off because of the recession that happened in 1913, back to less than 500,000. To put that in perspective, and this is just using an inflation calculator. This doesn't talk about the labor, the cheap, everything else. They had it would be the equivalent of $120 million today in building permits in 1912. So it'd be somewhere in between 120 and 150 million. So you're saying, well, how does that compare with today? Well, over the last 4 or 5 years in Moose Jaw, the average is somewhere in between 25 to 28 million. So that's using, you know, today's dollars. So, you know, it's almost 4 times. Well, it'd actually be more than 4 times the building was going on then. So that growth can be seen here. This is them building Central Collegiate, which at that time was Moose Jaw Technical Institute. This is what it looked like. This is 1909. This is Caribou Street right here, heading west. This would lead you over to Main Street here. This would be First Avenue right here. And this is what it looked like in 1909 as they were building Central Collegiate. 2 years later, bingo, this is what it looks like. I mean, that to me is phenomenal. You see the amount of housing, and you're saying, well, how do I know it's 1911? Up here on the hill, you can see it's actually the Seabourn house, this one here, being built. It doesn't have its turret yet. We know that Seabourn House was built in 1911. It's turretless at that point, so it's sometime during 1911. So that's on Clifton Avenue there. Now, I'm going to, everybody buckle up, because I'm going to just race through just some of the major buildings of what was built in that period from 1904 to 1914. Like, this doesn't include everything by any stretch of the imagination. There were all sorts of other buildings, but we're just going to race through these just so that we understand the scope of amount of building that was going on. Now we're going to start down at the beginning of Main Street on the west side, and we're going to start with the Ywca Block. Now, whenever you see these photos, they are street view photos, either 2015 or 2018. If I don't have a street view, I will compare it. Okay, so this is just to show you what's here. We got the Ywca Block, and that's next to the cornerstone. You can see it here, which was the Churchill, which was the maple leaf. That's 1907. And sorry, Bruce, I say Bruce all the time because I know Bruce is listening and he's looking and thinking, what about this? But we're just going to skip a few things, Bruce. So 1907 for the Ywca block. We jump up to the T.W. Robinson building, 1913-14 when it was built. We go up to the Dominion Bank building, which now is the Remax. You can see it here on the corner of High and Main. This is what they built. We skip across the street and you can see the Canadian Bank of Commerce. This is what was there. That was built in 1906. Next door to that was the 4-window Grayson building. That was the original building, this one here. And that was built in 1904. And it did have an addition added to it. You can see it here when you look across. If you're wondering what this is the excavation in 1912 for the Walter Scott block. You can see that little addition. There was actually a little space in between the bank, and it's not here because the addition was added by this time. But you can see there was an addition made. The windows are narrower. They just filled that in. The bank eventually took that over. But then when they knocked it down in the 60s, they built this and they actually filled in that spot, took up the whole area, and we were back to the original 4-window Grayson block. So then up from there, still on Main, still heading north, we have the first post office. That's 1906. And in this photograph here, you can actually see the one that you know being built. And the one that you know is this one. That's actually the one that we, know today, and we know it as City Hall, but that was the post office, the 1913 post office. But I'm just going to digress for a minute. So we go back here. This is the corner of Fairford and Main, looking west. And something that you can see in the background here, and that was also built during this time, that's the Old City Hall. So this is 1906, Old City Hall, 1904, 1905, which is now a parking lot. And actually the addition that was added to it, that was built in 1912. And then now you can see the old post office again, that here's the new one being built around it. It was actually built around it. And you can see that it's being built around it. And that was so that they could keep this one functioning. We'll get into these buildings in a minute here. So they could keep this one functioning. They built around it. Eventually, though, it ate it. They knocked the old one down. And this was built in 1913-14. You can see it. They haven't finished the dome here or anything else. And so that just shows you, like I said, they knocked down a perfectly good train station. It was only 22 years old. This was even less. This was 7 years old for the original post office, and down it goes to become this. The Hammond building is next. That was 1912. This right here was known as the Seabourn Block. This one right here, which is now filled in with this space here, that is built in 1907. This here is the Manley Loney and Company building. It was supposed to be 10 stories high. Love to show you a photograph of the plans, but anyway. So that was built in 1912-13. So now going back to Manitoba Street, we have what was known as the Royal George, which is now the park. and that was 1910, 1911. We go around the corner on Main, you can see Capone's here. And again, there's Capone's, and that is the CER Restaurant Building, 1908, which became the Exchange and the Royal, as a lot of us knew it. Next door to that is to the Masonic Temple Building. Now I'm using the original name, so just in case, that's 1906. And next to that is the Union Bank Wellington White Building. That's 1903. So it's just the year before, but I thought I'd throw it in there. These two buildings right here, this is the Matthew Ferguson block. And that was built in 19, sorry, just have to do something. I believe 1909 or something. I didn't write it down here. And Hawkins and Sin Hardware, 1905. Bank of Hamilton, this is on the corner of High Street in Maine. Now we're on the east side, remember. That's the Bank of Hamilton building, built in 1905. This is what it looks like today with the TD Bank. You can see the Walter Scott building over here. Next door to it, let's go back to the Walter Scott. We've got the Walter Scott building, and that's 1912. Next door to that is the Rex Theater, also 1912. There was this beautiful theater there. We're going to get into that a little bit more if I have time. I don't think I will. That's this little building right here now today. You can see it. Going up the street, we have the original Bank of Montreal, 1912. The Hughes Block, where the Uptown Cafe has been for the last 70 some odd years, 1912. Zion Church, 1906. And the Herbert Snell Building, 1912. I hope that's where the Rexall drugstore is now. It was became Johnstone Dairies, as a lot of us knew it. And I think you're getting the idea. Just how many? This is a 10-year period. This is just a 10-year period that all of these were built in. The library was built in that time. I took that because that's what you see now, trees, but the library was built in that time. The Grayson Merchant Bank building, built behind the CIBC building, was there for a while. You can see it being built here. This is 1912. This is the commercial building. This is Cumming was going to have a department store there. It didn't last very long. He built it in 1912, 13. Bad timing. Built this beautiful building, and boom, away it went because of the recession in 1912, 13. Land Titles Building, 1910. The Saskatchewan Government Telephones Building, this is on First Avenue, and that is literally was right behind the Land Titles Building at one time. And that was built in 1910. A little further up First Avenue, you got the Courthouse, and that was built in 1910. Just down, now the Courthouse is on Ymca, and just down from it to the west is the Ywca, which burned to the ground a few years ago. This is what's there now, but that was built in 1912. The Ymca, which is on Fairford, which is now the casino, that was built in 1909, 1908, 1909. Now back to First Avenue again, we've got the Times Block. And you can see it being excavated here. It was actually supposed to be 6 stories. Again, built in 1912. They probably ran out of money. It ended up being basically 3.5-story basement and then 3 stories rather than 6 stories, 1912. And then you get schools. You got Ross School, 1913, King George, 1913, St. Agnes, 1913. Sion Academy was about 1914, 15. Alexander School, 1906. Empire, 1910. That's actually the back of it. It's actually nicer from the front. And then you've got King Edward School. Now, King Edward School had a lot of iterations. It started out like this. They added on to it, and then eventually they built this. And that was in between 1912 and 1914. You've got the Boys' College, which became St. Anthony's Home, which became Chateau St. Michael, as you can see here. That is 1910, 1911. Prince Arthur School, 1912. That's on Athabasca. St. John's Church, 1910. St. Andrew's Church, 1912. St. Joseph's Church was started in 1911. They actually held, they built the basement, and that's where they held the services. It's actually St. Joseph's Parish, sorry. They held the services in the basement until they could gather up the funds, and in the 20s, they completed the rest of the structure. Then you have the fire hall. This is the #1 fire hall, still exists there on Fairford. This is the #2 fire hall. That's built in 1912. Sorry, did I say 1910 for this, for the first fire hall? This fire hall existed on Saskatchewan at First Avenue. So this is looking north. This is what's there now. That was built in 1912. It wasn't used very long. Now, all of those buildings I mentioned were all built in between 1904 and 1914. I know it's dizzying. It's a lot of information. And we haven't even touched on River Street. River Street is, you know, phenomenal. It's got the Cecil, but we'll go over here first. We'll go, I think I've got a photograph here. No, not that one. It's drying, that one. You've got the Matthew Ferguson block. I know I said that before, but this is their 1907 block. It was known as the Academy block later. That's 1907. The Lyric Theater beside it, 1907. When we go back here again, we've got the Merchant block down here, 1909. The Macmillan block, 1909. Dr. Turnbull building, which, you know, King's Royal Hotel fame, 1911. And that also housed the Blue Store, the Boston Cafe, and then the World Cafe. There's River Street again. We're going to get into the other side now with the Cecil and that. We got the Cecil, that is 1907. The Royal Block, 1912. And a separate photograph here shows you 2 buildings that were built almost simultaneously by Richard Harwood of Harwood Hotel fame, which became the Alexandra Hotel. They were built in 1907. Why he built one 2 stories and one of them 3 stories, who knows? And beside that, we've got the City Hotel, 1905. And then we go a little further down across the street on River on First, we got the Russell Block, the Empress Hotel. Look at that, fine dining. It was a lovely place. And High Street, we've got showing here, you know, it really changes. You can see this. They're working on the Massey Harris building in this one in 1911. You've got the Bunel Block, 1910, the Imperial Bank building, which is this one here with the pillars, 1909, the Lindsay Block beside it, which is built by the same person, John Lindsay. 1910. Beside that is the Battle Block. Battle Brothers built this in 1906, and the John Grayson Block also built in 1906. Now this is High Street looking west. You can see the mill over here. That's the old mill, by the way. That's the old Robin Hood mill. And so when you jump forward, you can actually see two more buildings added. Oh, by the way, these two down here, the John Grayson and the Battle, they were joined. The facades were joined later and made to look common. It was known, I believe, as the Jubilee Block. That's where Hub Meat Market was, and the Club 71 restaurant, things like that. But then you can see in this photograph, which jumps forward just 1 year, like literally 1 year, because when we go back here, streetcars are running. That's 1911. This is 1912. And already you can see that the Massey Harris building has been built. The Miller building has been built. And see, I'm not mentioning all these others because, like the Bellamy Broadfoot buildings and that, because they weren't built in that period. So we're going to jump forward a little bit here because I know we're running out of time. On the other side of High Street, you know, this is what it looks like today, looking east from First Avenue. This is what it used to look like. This is probably 1930s. This is the Binnings Fair building, which they didn't occupy it for a long time. It became Moose Jaw Heating and Plumbing for years and years. The Royal Bank building, but that wasn't built during that time, but this was. Well, there it is again. You can see the Walter Scott building being built. Some guy was having trouble with his horse. This is the first year, the first day of the electric streetcars, August 19th, 1911. Now, another building that was built during that time, this was already existing. This is the old mill, the old Robin Hood mill, and they had a fire December 15th, 1911. And from its ashes, 1912, 1913, came this structure here. It was actually this first, and then this was added later to get to where we are now. So I know we're running out of time here. So I hope that wasn't too quick for everybody. There's just so much information that I could talk about here. There is just so much information, like how the Ywca block ended up losing this section right here to get to where we are today. And, you know, the fires, like this is the 1960s fire for the Modern Cafe that used to stand right here next to the National. And after the fire, this building was taken out and stayed vacant for years, and they chopped this off. It looked like this after they were done. We could talk, fire is a common thread here. We could talk about this building, the Masonic Temple, and how in the early 20s, another fire took it, and it changed from that to what we see today, 3 windows, square windows, as opposed to those, you know, arched windows. We know the fire started in the basement, went up, and that it isn't a new building. The reason why we know that, the old souvenir postcard sign. This is before, this is when it was nice and new and fancy. And you can see it's still here, but it's been chopped off on the side. That's why that was like that for a long time, because it went from this to this. Anyway, I better stop here. I'm sorry. I have so much more. I could do this all day long. I hope I haven't gone too fast for everybody. I just wanted to give everybody an idea of the scope of how much building there was in Moose Jaw from 1904 to 1914. It's never been, nothing like that has ever occurred, especially 1912, 1913. we're 5 million and 4 million, the equivalent of, like I say, 110, 140 million dollars today was put into it. So I will stop there.